right, if you look in your Bibles in the book of Revelation, chapter 17, we'll continue on in our studies. In our last lesson, we examined Mystery Babylon the Great and the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth, as she was described in Revelation 17:5 that way. And we spent basically the entirety of our lesson last week identifying Mystery Babylon as the false religious system that originated in Babel or Babylon shortly after the flood. And we traced this false religious system down through the years and across the world. And I believe we were clearly able to see how the world and its leaders have indeed been intoxicated by this false religious system, and will even be that way very much more so during the tribulation period. And now that we've established who Mystery Babylon the Great is, let's continue looking at Revelation chapter 17 and examine the beast and see what the outcome of Mystery Babylon the Great is. If you look there in verse 1, it says, "And there came one of the seven angels which had the seven vials, and talked with me, saying unto me, Come hither, I will show unto thee the judgment of the great whore that sitteth upon many waters." And so we're told that this great whore, known as Mystery Babylon, sits upon many waters. And we've mentioned this previously in our studies, that we don't have to speculate to what that means, what it's symbolic or figurative of when it speaks of these waters. Because if you look in Revelation 17 and down at verse 15, he tells us, "And he saith unto me, The waters which thou sawest, where the whore sitteth, are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues." And so it's pretty simple explanation there. The waters upon which the great whore sits are the peoples, the nations of the earth. And that's what it's speaking of. Now, I think that we should stop and realize that I believe there's significance to the fact that she is sitting this way. Because when we think of someone sitting, if you're sitting upon a horse, we realize that the horse is carrying you. It's supporting you and carrying you. If you sit in a chair, the chair is supporting you, holding you up, and so forth. And so immediately when we think of someone sitting this way upon something, we see that something or that someone as supporting that individual. And so I believe that the picture being drawn in our text is that the great whore is being supported by and carried by the people of the nations of the earth. And that is why she's sitting upon the waters that represent the people of the earth. And so the second important thing to note is that she is also described as sitting upon the beast. If you look in Revelation chapter 17 there and look at verse 3, "So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sit upon a scarlet-colored beast, full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns." And so the woman that he's seeing, of course, is the great whore that's being spoken of here. And so she is seen as sitting here upon the beast. If you look at verse 7, it says, "And the angel said unto me, Wherefore didst thou marvel? I will tell thee the mystery of the woman and the beast that carrieth her." Notice that the beast she's sitting on is carrying her, just like we described a moment ago, "which hath 7 heads and 10 horns." And so verse 8, we have a description there of the beast. "The beast that thou sawest was and is not, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit, and go into perdition. and they that dwell on the earth shall wander, whose names were not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they behold the beast that was and is not and yet is. And so we think about how interesting it is how the beast is described here. Why is the beast described as the beast that was and is not and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit? Now, we ought to recognize that description because it's a description of the Antichrist, which is one and the same with the beast. And so, he was and is not describes how that the Antichrist comes on the scene at the beginning of the 7-year tribulation period. And so he is, or he exists. That's why he is declared that way. And so then we know that at the midpoint of the tribulation period, we've learned in our studies that the Antichrist will receive a deadly wound. If you look in Revelation chapter 13 and verse 3, it says, "And I saw one of his heads, as it were, wounded to death." And so it's important to note that it's wounded to death. We're talking about being dead here, a deadly wound. And his deadly wound was healed, and all the world wandered after the beast. And so you notice that verse 3 in Revelation chapter 13 describes the world wandering after the beast who had his deadly wound healed there at the midpoint of the tribulation period. And then in Revelation 17:8, it's describing to us the same thing when it says, "The beast that thou sawest was and is not, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition, and they that dwell on the earth shall wander, whose names are not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they behold the beast that was and is not, and yet is." And so it's describing the same thing, just in a little different wording, in Revelation 13:3 and then in Revelation 17:8. And so that's because it's describing the same beast to us and the same event to us. And so the Antichrist comes on the scene at the beginning of the tribulation period, and that's why he's described as he was, because he's existing at that point. Then the Antichrist receives that deadly wound at the midpoint of the tribulation period, and that's why he's being described as he is not, because he was alive, and now he is not alive. And so that's why it's being described that way. Then he is healed from his deadly wound and resurrected back to life, possessed by Satan himself, who gives him that resurrection and possesses his body at that point. And so he is described as ascending from the bottomless pit. And that's why, is because at the midpoint, after he receives that deadly wound, then Satan is going to possess him, literally. And so when he is healed from that deadly wound, the inhabitants of the earth, whose names are not written in the Lamb's book of life, they wander after the beast or the Antichrist when they see this great miraculous looking event take place. Now, the third important thing to notice is that according to Revelation 17:9, this great whore also sits on 7 mountains. And so, if you look at verse 9, it says, "And here is the mind which hath wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sitteth." And so, the heads and the mountains are one and the same, and the woman is sitting upon these 7 mountains. And so the 7 mountains are the same as the 7 heads of the beast that were previously described. And so the 7 heads and the 7 mountains, they're representing the same thing. And we're told what they represent in verse 10. It says, "And there are 7 kings, 5 are fallen, and one is, and the other is not yet come. And when he cometh, he must continue a short space." And so they represent the 7 world ruling kingdoms or kings. And we're told that 5 had fallen, one is, and the other is not yet come. And so these 7 kings are the 7 world ruling empires that we learned about in our studies in the book of Daniel. And they were the Egyptian, the Assyrian, the Babylonian, the Medo-Persian, the Grecian, the Roman, and then that revived Roman Empire that will exist during the tribulation period. Now, in John's day, as John is writing what we're reading here by the inspiration of God, and as he is having these things revealed to him in a vision by God, as he was writing this, 5 of the kingdoms had already fallen. And so that's what he's stating there in Revelation 17:10. One was in existence in John's day, and that was the 6th king, or the Roman Empire that it speaks of. And then one had not yet come. That speaks of the revived Roman Empire of the tribulation period, which was the 7th head that we're seeing there. Now, if you look in verse 11 of chapter 17, it says, "And the beast that was and is not, even he is the 8th, and is of the 7, and goeth into perdition." Now, this is describing the Antichrist from the beginning of the tribulation period to the midpoint of the tribulation period as being the 7th ruler. That's what it's describing first off. And then this passage is also describing the Antichrist from the midpoint of the tribulation period to the end of the tribulation period as being the 8th king, who is of the 7th. Now, the 7th head is the Antichrist in his mortal human form, who will be reigning during that first half of the tribulation period over the revived Roman Empire. And then at the midpoint of the tribulation period, he receives that deadly wound. And at that point, Satan possesses him, resurrecting his body from that deadly wound. And the Satan-possessed, resurrected Antichrist is then the 8th ruler, which is of the 7. Now, something else that's very interesting to notice is you notice that it says he is of the 7, not of the 7th. And so the Satan-possessed Antichrist of the last half of the tribulation period is of all 7 previous rulers and kingdoms, because Satan has had his hand in each of these all down through the ages, even as we kind of glanced at last week in our lesson and looked at this mystery Babylon hard at work here. That's Satan orchestrating all of that. And so that's why he's being referred to not just of the 7th, but of the 7, because he has been a part of all of that, and now he literally possesses the Antichrist starting at the midpoint of the tribulation period. And so that kind of says it all there about the entire system. But the revived Roman Empire that he will reign over will be a combination of all of the previous empires put together, because even in our studies when we looked at those empires coming into existence, as Daniel gave us those visions that God had given him, and he shared all that information with us, and we look at that and realize that as one kingdom, as one world ruling kingdom would go out of control and another would take their place, they basically swallowed up the one that was before them. And so they basically just were absorbed and became a part of that. And so they're all seven a mixture in that sense. And so the Antichrist reigns during that first half of the tribulation period as a mere mortal man. But after he receives his deadly wound, he is then resurrected, being possessed by Satan himself. So his mortal body then is possessed by the devil himself during the last half of the tribulation period. Now, if you look at verse 12 in chapter 17, and we'll read verse 12 through 14, it says, "And the 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings, which have received no kingdom as yet, but receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast. These have one mind, and shall give their power and strength unto the beast. These shall make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb shall overcome them, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and they that are with him are called and chosen and faithful." And so here we see the 10 horns described as the 10 kings, and we previously noted in our studies that these 10 horns are the same as those 10 toes of the great image seen by Nebuchadnezzar in a dream which Daniel interpreted. And they also are the same as the 10 horns that Daniel saw in a vision back in Daniel chapter 7. And so the 10 toes and the 10 horns represent 10 kings within the revived Roman Empire that will exist during the tribulation period. And so we learned this in our studies in the book of Daniel, and according to the vision that Daniel had in Daniel chapter 7, the Antichrist will rise to power in the middle of the 10 kings of the revived Roman Empire. He will come up. And according to the vision that Daniel had, the Antichrist, after rising to power, will subdue 3 of the 10 kings. And we know by the information found in our text that we just read that the other 7 kings out of the 10, they must willingly then submit to the Antichrist after he overcomes the 3, because according to what we just read there in verse 12, all 10 kings will be under the reign and authority of the Antichrist. And so we can see that. Now, if you look at verse 13 and 14 of what we read there, those 10 kings will be in unity with the Antichrist. They will give their power and strength to him, and they will also unite with the Antichrist in making war with the Lamb as he returns with his saints to set up the millennial kingdom. Now, if we look at verse 16 through 18, it says, "And the 10 horns which thou sawest upon the beast, these shall hate the whore, and shall make her desolate and naked, and shall eat her flesh and burn her with fire. For God hath put in their hearts to fulfill his will, and to agree and give their kingdom unto the beast, until the words of God shall be fulfilled. And the woman which thou sawest is that great city which reigneth over the kings of the earth." And so we look at this and we see that when Satan is finished, when he's finished using his one world religious system, she'll be scrapped. He will do away with her. And so according to verse 16, the 10 horns, which represent the 10 kings of the revived Roman Empire, they're going to turn on that one world religious system and destroy her and devour her. The 10 kings are united with the Antichrist, and even as Christ returns with his saints at the end of the tribulation period to set up his millennial kingdom, we find that the 10 kings will be united with the Antichrist in making war with the Lamb. And so we should not see Revelation 17:16 as describing the 10 kings turning on the Antichrist, because that's not what's happening. They're unified with him all the way through. But what they are doing is they're turning on the great whore, the religious system here, because the Antichrist is finished with it. He's finished with it, and so now he will do away with it. And so basically Satan created the great whore, or the false religious system, and used her over the years to bring himself into ultimate power during the last half of the tribulation period through the Antichrist that he will literally possess at that time. And so once Satan feels that he's gained full control, he's going to destroy that same system that he utilized to bring himself to power. And so as we conclude this chapter, we take a moment to think about what we've seen up to this point. The great whore, the false religious system, is seen sitting upon the beast, or the Antichrist. She's also seen sitting upon the many waters, or the people and multitudes and nations that make up the world. Lastly, she is seen sitting upon the 7 mountains, which are the same as the 7 heads, symbolic of the 7 world empires used by Satan. And so the great whore sits upon all of these, the same as a rider would sit upon a horse and ride a horse. And so the horse carries the rider, and the rider is believed to be the one that's in control, with a bridle and a bit, and you take it whichever direction you're wanting the horse to go. But even Revelation 17:18 describes the great whore as if she is in control. It says, "The beast that thou sawest was and is not, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit, and go into perdition, and they that dwell on the earth shall wander, whose names are written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they behold the beast that was and is not, and yet is." And so when we think about how by the time you get to verse 18, it says, "And the woman which thou sawest is that great city, which reigneth over the kings of the earth." And so you notice she's described as if she were in control. Okay? But we know that the beast, which is the Antichrist, and also we know that the peoples and the multitudes and nations and tongues that we read of there, and also the 7 world ruling empires, they are all in the last half of the tribulation period make up basically the kingdom of Satan as it will be upon earth at that point. And so the overall picture in Revelation 17 is like a picture of a horse that throws its rider, if you will, and tramples the rider to death. Because Satan and his kingdom throw the great whore. I mean, she's riding along, and all of a sudden she's thrown off and she's destroyed. And so after throwing her off, she's completely destroyed. And so we can see in that how Satan uses that system until he's finished, and then he just throws it off. And so as we move in to this next chapter, and we think about how Satan has continued to use this system, we've noted how that this false religious system has been in the works since shortly after the flood in Genesis, and Satan has continued to use this system over the years to work on bringing about this one world religious and political system. And he will continue to do this until he rises to full world power during the last half of the tribulation period. And so in chapter 17, as we were looking at this, we saw that once Satan is finished with the one world religious system, he does away with her. And so as we enter into Revelation chapter 18, we need to realize that we're still going to be looking at the destruction of Babylon, because Revelation chapter 18 covers a different aspect of the same Babylon that we just got finished looking at in chapter 17. Revelation chapter 17 covered that religious aspect of Babylon. Chapter 18, we're going to find, is covering that political aspect. You remember last week as we were looking at this, we previously traced the false religious system of Mystery Babylon all the way back to the literal city of Babel or Babylon back there in Genesis 10:10. And when we studied that out, we showed that within Babylon, there was a political aspect, and then there was a religious aspect. And the political aspect could be seen in the building of the city itself and the people gathering together in one place rather than spreading abroad and multiplying as God had told them to. And so the religious aspect is seen in the building of the Tower of Babel within the city and building it up into the heavens. And so just as surely as there was a political and religious aspect at the beginning of Babylon, there will be a political and a religious aspect at the conclusion of Babylon during the tribulation period. And so as we enter the study of chapter 18, I think we need to understand that chapter 18 deals with the political aspect of Babylon, while chapter 17 is dealing with that religious aspect of Babylon. And so the religious aspect of Babylon will be destroyed by the hands of literal men, as we saw there in Revelation 17:16. And we learned that the 10 horns represent the 10 kings that are confederate with Satan, the Satan-possessed Antichrist at that time. And this is clearly seen in what we read there in chapter 17 in verses 12 through 14, where we pointed out that they're going to remain confederate with the Antichrist even as Christ returns with his saints at the conclusion of the 7-year tribulation period. And so the political aspect of Babylon is seen in Revelation 18, and it's going to be destroyed by God himself. And so a literal city referred to as Babylon will be the center of Satan's reign through the Antichrist that he possesses during that last half of the tribulation period. And God pours his judgment out upon that city in Revelation chapter 18, bringing her to utter destruction. And so as we look at this, if you look in Revelation chapter 18 and verse 1 and 2, it says, "And after these things I saw another angel come down from heaven, having great power, and the earth was lightened with his glory. And he cried mightily with a strong voice, saying, Babylon the Great is fallen, and is become the habitation of devils, and the hold of every foul spirit, in a cage of every unclean and hateful bird." And so we think about this description, and here we see another angel coming down from heaven, declaring the fall of Babylon. And you notice he describes the city as being the habitation of devils and the hold of every foul spirit. And you remember, this city will be the capital of Antichrist's kingdom. And so at the midpoint of the tribulation period, Satan is permanently cast out of heaven. You remember we talked about before how Satan, he currently has access to heaven. I mean, he roams the earth, he goes to heaven, comes back to the earth, and he roams around and does many different things. He's known as the accuser of the brethren, and he still accuses the brethren. And we know back in Revelation chapter 1 and verse 6, we see a description of him there as he is in heaven, accusing one of the brethren. He's accusing Job, and he's basically saying, hey, your servant Job over here, he wouldn't be so faithful to you if you didn't bless him so much. But he's over here, he's well, he's wealthy, he's got a great family, all these different things. But you just touch some of that stuff, and he'll be done with you. And so he's making accusations and accusing old Job. And so we see what Satan is all about there. And we see that he is able to go back and forth and to go to heaven and be the accuser and then come back to the earth and then roam around. But we know that at the midpoint of the tribulation period, Satan and his angels, those fallen angels that followed him in the fall, they're going to be cast out permanently, no longer having access to the heavenlies. And so if you look in Revelation chapter 12, in verse 7 through 10, and there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon fought and his angels. And we've seen before that the dragon, of course, is Satan. And prevailed not, neither was their place found any more in heaven. And the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent, called the devil and Satan, which deceiveth the whole world. He was cast out into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. And so we can see that at that point, at the midpoint, he is cast out of the heavenlies, no longer permitted to go back and forth between heaven and earth. And so it is at the midpoint that the Antichrist is possessed by Satan and raised up from that deadly wound. And so the reason I point all that out and remind us of it is because you can imagine how Babylon will indeed be filled, as it's described here in our text, with devils and every foul spirit, as Satan and these other fallen angels are going to be dwelling there. And they're going to be wreaking havoc. In Revelation chapter 18 and verse 3, it says, "For all nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication, and the kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth are waxed rich through the abundance of her delicacies." And so we think about how we noted previously the nations of the earth and the kings of the earth had committed fornication with Babylon the Great, speaking of the religious aspect of Babylon, and had committed that spiritual fornication with Babylon the Great. Now we see that the same thing is true concerning the political aspect. And the kings and the nations of the earth, they've united with her politically as well as religiously. And so you can see from this particular passage, the merchants of the earth have become very wealthy through their relationship with Babylon. And it's always easy many times to get people to compromise for monetary gain or earthly riches. You think about how we see this many times in the world when people are tempted by money, and we see corruption because it's so easy for somebody to say, well, I can do this for you, and the result will be you can earn all this money, or you can have this particular position, and different things of that nature. And we know how tempting that becomes to man. And so the same will hold true during the tribulation period, as the entire world seeks to profit from a relationship with Satan's religious and political world system. And I don't think that it would be that difficult for someone to step on the scene in a time of turmoil and to be able to gather the population of the world together and do this, because we have seen, especially here in the last year or so, and all the things that have taken place, and all of the sickness and the chaos and all the different things, And we can see just how easy it would be for someone to come along and try to unite everyone all around the world. Hey, we don't need walls and fences and all these things. We'll just be a one world system, you think about how many people would like that idea, especially if they thought that it benefited them some way in the pocketbook. You think about how easy it is to reel people in with money. I mean, you start talking money and people seem to draw a blind eye to lots of things, Hey, I can make your check bigger, or I'll just send you one and you can stay at home, and people suddenly, they become blind to many other corrupt things. Oh, I don't see this, I don't see that. I just see money. And so we think about how this will be working the same way during the tribulation period. And I think we can see by looking at the world around us and all the changes, how quickly and easily something like that could transpire. But we'll leave off at this point in our studies, and Lord willing, we'll pick back up there next Wednesday and continue on.